We're going to talk about rivers today, not just rivers of water, but rivers of ice, which we call glaciers. Talk about rivers of underground water, streams under the ground that erode caves and caverns. We'll also look at rivers of sand, both in what they call dune fields, deserts, but also along the shorelines, and how this rivers of sand along the shoreline shape the shorelines. We'll also look at rivers of dirt, landslides, avalanches, and so on. This will be the third unit for the course. The first was space science, astronomy. That exam's open, you can take that. Also, we looked at oceans, not just oceans of atmosphere, air, but oceans of magnetism above, oceans of water below the hydrosphere, and below that the ocean of the lithosphere of rock. So now we're going to begin looking at rivers. It's a famous photographic portrait by Ansel Adams showing the Rocky Mountains, part of the Teton Range. In the foreground you can see a river flowing from it, the Snake River. The mountains are being picked up and thrown into the sea, as Jesus said. Geologists say that that's a true statement. Sand grain by sand grain, rivers are taking the mountain and carrying them to the sea and dumping them into the sea. And so I want to talk a little bit about the principles of that transport system. Here's the same location in color, showing the meandering, the snake pattern of the Snake River coming out of the Rockies. If you take a glass of water or a glass full of sand and you pour water into it, the water will trickle down through the sand grains and it reaches the bottom of the glass, and then it will pile up. It will build up to a certain level. The glass could either be half full or half empty, but depending on your particular psychological persuasion. But let's say that it's half full or half empty. There's a zone below at the bottom of the glass where all the sand grains are full of water. Between the sand grains, the pore spaces are full of water. They call that the zone of saturation. Above that level, at the top of the glass, there's sand where there's not any water in the pore spaces between the grains. They call that the zone of aeration. So one part is full of air, the other part is full of water, and there is a boundary, and that boundary between those two zones is called the water table, which you've probably heard, a common term in English, the water table. And so this diagram shows the zone of saturation below, the blue area, the zone of aeration above, and you can see that dash, that dotted line, that's marking the water table. As rivers cut downward into the terrain, they create a channel, usually a V shape for river valleys, sort of a U shape or V shape channel. And whenever the bottom of that channel is below the water table, they call that an influent stream, meaning the water is flowing into the stream. So as the stream flows, it's gaining water, not just from runoff, but the groundwater is adding to the spring. Whenever the bottom of the channel is the bottom of the channel is above the water table, that's called an exfluent stream, meaning that the water in the channel is actually leaving the channel. It's leaking, so to speak. You have a river that leaks into the surrounding terrain, and so the water of the channel is actually adding to the groundwater. All right, so hopefully now you understand the zone of aeration, zone of saturation, the water table, separating those two zones, and also the fact that depending upon the location of the water table, rivers can either gain water in an influent stream or they can lose water in an exfluent stream. I want to also talk to you a little bit about the velocity and the typical stream flow. This is a diagram showing a cross-section of the channel, and the arrows you see there represent vectors. That means that the longer the arrow, the higher the velocity. The shorter the arrow, the lower the velocity. And so what this demonstrates is that in a channel, the highest velocity is in the center of the channel, And the lowest velocity is along the edges of the channel, at the bottom and along the channel wall. The reason for that is simply due to frictional drag. As the water is moving through the channel, it's making contact with the channel wall, and therefore there's a certain amount of friction, and that friction pulls energy out of the flow and slows it down. If you've ever been inner tubing, you've gone to New Braunfels or something, got into the tube and floated down the Guadalupe, you know this from experience. You get out in the middle, it's moving really, really fast. You get along the shoreline, not only is it moving slow, if you're in a rapids area, the water is actually moving upstream along the shoreline. In other words, it's reverse flow. Is that a good thing for you if you're inner tubing down the Guadalupe? Yes, it's a great thing because you can get along the edge and it will actually carry you back upstream. So you don't have to get out and carry your inner tube under your arm for half a mile back up to where you started in the rapids. Because when you do that, you get this black stuff from the inner tube under your armpits and it looks really horrible. So if you know that you have reverse flow along the edges, then that'll save you some time and energy. All right, whenever streams are flowing over large rocks, especially when it's fairly shallow, it will create a breaking of the surface of the water. They call that turbulent flow. However, if this channel is deep, even if the water is flowing very rapidly, if you have a deep channel, there's no frictional drag that appears at the surface, and it creates a nice smooth surface. They call that laminar flow. So you can actually tell the depth of a stream by looking at the surface of the water. This is a very beautiful sort of man-made river channel they've created here with some cherry blossoms over it. But if you look carefully at the stream that's flowing there, you can see where the channel is deeper. You see how the surface looks like a mirror? That's what they call laminar flow. And then when it gets to a shallow area with rocks that are sticking above the surface, you see how the surface is broken up? That's called turbulent flow. Basically, three types of definitions for surfaces of streams: laminar, which means deep and fast; turbulent, which means shallow and slow. Even though it looks like the water's moving fast, actually it's moving slower overall than it would in a deep channel. And there's a third called jet flow, and that's where the water's actually shooting. And when you have a roaring rapids where the water's hitting rocks and shooting up into the air, that would be jet flow. All right. One of the key processes of stream flow is something called meandering. It just means to move side to side. If you've ever been on a street called Meandering Way or something, it's a street that moves back and forth and back and forth, and streams will do that. When you look at an aerial shot here of a river valley, it can look like a snake, and it actually moves like a snake. If you've ever seen a snake move through grass, it makes these loops that move back and forth. You've seen a high pressure hose that someone has let loose and it's whipping back and forth. It's basically the same type of process. And I want to give you sort of a small lesson in physics to try to help you understand why that process takes place, why rivers move like snakes. All right, so if we look at this river, it's cutting its channel through vegetation. This is infrared photography. And so what you're seeing is actually plants. It's measuring heat rather than light. I know it looks strange as red, but it actually is a great image to show the detail of what's taken place in the past. All right, as water moves around this bend, there's a certain cascade of events that occurs, and it's due simply to a process called the conservation of angular momentum. Whenever something goes around a bend and it's fluid where it can move as separate units, the outer part will move faster than the inner part. I remember when I was a kid, we had skating parties and we go to the roller rink, and there was usually a column somewhere in the middle of the roller rink to hold up the roof, and we would skate in circles. And we would hold hands, form a line. The person on the inside would grab the pole as we went around the bend, and the person at the pole was moving quite slowly, but that person out on the very edge was moving extremely rapidly, and we were holding hands, and so we were all connected together. And we would sling him around and he would fly down the roller rink or whatever. But there was always that time when the person who was not the last on the end, but the second to the last, who would pretend to be holding the guy's hand, and right when he reached maximum velocity, he would let go. And because he would let go, it was no longer connected, he would behave like a fluid and he would fly out due to angular momentum and the conservation of angular momentum, and he would smash into the wall. And I remember there was like erosion along the outer bend where bodies had crashed into the wall from playing that game so many times. Same thing happens in rivers. As the water moves around this bend, the water on the outside wants to continue in a straight line. It's according to Newton's first law of motion, that once something is set in motion, it will want to travel in a straight line unless it's acted on by another force. And the water does the same thing. It wants to move in a straight line, but the channel is bending. And so the water on the outside will not only speed up, but it begins to impinge upon this outer bank. And as it goes around the bend, that process will actually cut into the bank and erode it. And so this outer bend of the river, they call the cut bank. Now that same process I just described is reversed on the interior part, around the inside of the bend. The water slows down, just like the person on the inside of Crack the Whip is moving slower. And so as water slows down, it's not eroding, it's actually dropping the sediment that it's carrying. It's just another principle of physics. When you have any kind of fluid, the faster that it's moving, the larger the material it can carry. And so if you have a river that's flowing very rapidly, it can not only have mud, support mud, but it can actually suspend not just sand grains, but even gravel can be moved along the banks or the bottom of the river. Whenever it slows down, that sediment comes out. If you've ever been in a rapids area and you get out of the canoe or out of the boat, out of the inner tube, you notice it's very easy to float. The water itself is carrying you along, is supporting your body. But then whenever the velocity slows down, you have to begin treading water again. The same way with any kind of sediment. Faster it's moving, the larger the sediment it can carry. So when the velocity slows down on the inside of the bend, it drops sediment. Sediment comes out of suspension and it forms these white areas you see here called point bars. All right, so what is happening along the bend of a river? The outside bank, the cut bank, is being cut away and the inside bend is being deposited. So the point bar is building out as the cut bank is cutting away. So that means the channel is actually moving outward and downstream. And if you take that process and rather than being just a few days, you see hundreds of years, you will see that river valley snaking, whipping back and forth. And that's a process called meandering. If you look at the red area there, you can actually see the older channel walls as it's moved. As the cut bank is cutting in here, everyone looking right here, you guys watching? Not seeing any eyes on the screen. You guys have the image on your computers? Okay. As it comes around this outer bend here, it's cutting away. So that means it's cutting toward the other channel. What will eventually happen is these two channels will connect. As this cut bank cuts away and that cut bank cuts away, they call that, geologists call that a neck cutoff, which I love geology because they don't translate stuff into Greek and Latin. They just use good old Anglo-Saxon words, a neck cutoff. So you see the head here? There's the head. And this is the neck. And so it's coming through, it will cut off the head, a neck cutoff. And what happens is rather than the water flowing around this bend, it will take the shortcut through this way. And this bend will be abandoned. Whenever that occurs, that abandoned bend in the river is called a meander scar. Initially, they call it an oxbow lake because it still has water in it, but eventually the water will evaporate and it becomes a meander scar. Okay, so if you look carefully right here, you see this loop? That's an older neck cutoff. In other words, there was a time not too long ago when this river traveled in this pattern. And as the cut bank moved in, it actually formed a neck cutoff. And this was an abandoned channel that was full of water, and as with water in it, it was called an oxbow lake. They call it an oxbow lake because it looks kind of like an oxbow, that wooden thing you put around the neck of an ox when they pull a cart, an oxbow. And so they would call that an oxbow lake. However, the lake is dried up now, except for this one small part. And so they don't call that an oxbow lake anymore. It's called a meander scar. So an abandoned meander becomes a oxbow lake and eventually a meander scar. All right. This process explains why it's tempting to use river valleys as political boundaries, like the north boundary of Texas and Oklahoma is the Red River. It's common to do that, but it's not a very good idea. The reason it's not a good idea is because of this neck cutoff. Let's say that this is the Red River. Let me see if I can reorient. All right, let's say this is the Red River. So this is Oklahoma, right? And this is Texas. And then we have a neck cutoff. And you live right here. What does that mean? You go to sleep as a Texan and you wake up as an Okie. So yeah, whenever you use a river as a political boundary and you have a neck cutoff, people that live along that river, they can change states overnight. Another way that this affects economics is that, let's say that you owned a cotton plantation right here, and your competitor owned a cotton plantation here, and your competitor went and started digging a ditch in the neck. And they did that to where they would intentionally cause the river to change courses. And so your plantation was no longer on the river and you would go out of business. This is a GIF that shows the process of a neck cutoff that I'm describing. They've just taken several satellite images and put them together. See how the river valley is snaking back and forth? Comes in, cuts off, that becomes an oxbow lake. Does that make sense now? Can also see the point bars forming and the cut banks moving out. See the cut bank moving out here? Right there, moving out, forming a point bar. It's just due to the change in velocity of the river, which is due to conservation of angular momentum around the bend. This is a photograph showing a neck cutoff about to occur. Extremely narrow connection between those two channels. All right, just go show you some of these terms on the ground. This is what? See the river coming around the bend? So what would you call this? It's on the inside of the bend. Inside the bend is a point bar where the water slows down, sediment drops. Outside the bend is called the cut bank. You can even see how it's eroding the dirt. If you're buying land, real estate along a river, do you want to buy on the point bar or the cut bank? It's really not a good idea to buy land on a river anyway, because it changes so rapidly if you're going to give it to your grandchildren anyway. If you want it for just one generation, it may be okay. You don't want to buy on the cut bank. It'll be nice elevated land with a nice view of the river, but you do not want to buy this land because every storm you're losing a major portion of your property. And it is a loss because that river is the way they mark where your land starts and stops. All right. All right, here's somebody who built a really nice house on a cut bank. This is what eventually happens. Here's some other examples I found on the internet of people that built on the cut bank. And the undercutting eroded into their foundation. And not only did they lose land, but they lost all of the improvements that they placed on the land that goes face first into the river, especially during storms, when you have a very high rate of erosion. It's usually what sets it off. Even on a small scale, you can see the sandbars that develop on the inside of the bend and the cut bank on the outside. Point bar, cut bank. Even in very large scale, such as the Colorado River cutting through the Grand Canyon, you see the point bar here and the cut bank as it comes around the bend. Even when you have jungles, such as in the Amazon, you can see the same process. The trees are living on a different time scale. And so you form the oxbow lakes with net cutoffs. You can see how the channel wants to straighten itself. All right, there's another feature of stream flow that you need to be familiar with, and it's called levee formation. You may have heard the term levees. Most of the time, when you hear a reference to levees today, it's talking about man-made levees, but nature also makes levees. All right, so if this is the channel, and water is moving through the channel, whenever a flood occurs, that level of the water actually rises. And when the level of the water reaches the top of the channel, they call that cresting. All right, so cresting occurs right before you have a flood. As the water flows out of the channel, it slows down just because of the frictional drag. The shape that has the least surface area per unit volume is a circle. And so the channel in nature is actually a circle, you see it? But since gravity is pushing everything to the bottom of the circle, we don't even consider that part. It's the reason we see pipes, they're always, the cross-section of pipes always round. You don't see square pipes because it would create too much frictional drag. A circular pipe is much more efficient, and nature wants to be efficient, so it creates a semicircular channel. And so the water in the channel is moving very efficiently, very rapidly. But whenever the water crests and comes out, then you have this very narrow, very thin layer of water with lots of friction. And so the water slows down drastically. Remember what we said about water moving fast carries large particles, lots of sediment. Water moving slowly dumps its sediment. But when the water first comes out of the channel, it begins to dump its sediment right there. It would be like, let's say you're helping your brother-in-law move into his apartment. It's like on the 3rd floor. And so it takes a lot of work to get up to the 3rd floor. So you're not going to carry the box into the bedroom. You're just going to dump it right at the door. So whenever it begins to slow down and lose energy, it dumps it right at the door, right at the edge of the channel. And so through time, it builds up into what's called a levee. And so if we have the channel snaking off into the distance like this, we have this ridge that occurs along the edge of the channel. And so I'm going to exaggerate just to show you here, but let's say we have a fairly large levee along the edge, then now this is the new crest. But this isn't a nice semicircle. So what nature does, it begins to deposit material here until it gets back into this nice semicircular shape. So you're actually depositing material at the bottom of the channel. So you see what's happening, the channel's being elevated because of the levees. It's rising up into the air. And so let's say you get a really good deal on some property right here and you build your house. Not a good idea to build your house here in the floodplain because there's the water is going to come over and flood your house. And so the water itself is being elevated, which creates a tremendous amount of gravitational energy. So it's under pressure. So whenever the levee breaks, water flows out into the floodplain very, very rapidly. All right. So what you see here in the image, the picture, is a break in the levee. Here's the levee. And that's where it's broken. You can see the water shooting out of the channel into the surrounding terrain. The floodplain. Very difficult to get flood insurance in a floodplain. Matter of fact, you won't get flood insurance if you decide to build your house in the floodplain. Here's another broken levee. You see the power of the water coming out. Why is it coming out so rapidly? Because this whole channel has been elevated about 10 feet above the floodplain. Broken levee on the, I think this is Lake Pontchartrain. Give me just a second. I need to turn on sound share.
Better get some back. Under 8 waterlogged weeks, trouble spot.
All right, this is what they call a seep. A seep occurs whenever you have water. It's when you have a cresting along a levee, the water is being pushed underneath the levee here, and it comes out at the bottom. And it means that the river is actually cutting a cavern, a cave underneath the levee. It'll eventually collapse. Matter of fact, levees don't break by the water coming over the levee. They break by the water going under the levee and eroding into a seep. And so he says, you better get some sandbags here quick. That's ridiculous to put sandbags over it because the full force of the river is actually pushing that water through, and a few sandbags are not going to hold it. Even if you put like cement blocks and poured cement into it, it would just go around it. Once that seep begins to form, there's really not much you can do. That levee is eventually going to collapse.
Were cropping up on the earth. Under 8 waterlogged weeks, trouble spots were cropping up on the earthen walls. Better get some bags here quick. Even a small seep of water could pose a grave threat. In just minutes, this situation went from threat to catastrophe. With luck, Vern hoped to stem the tide and buy time for those families whose homes stood in the water.
All right, so this is Vern in the front loader there. He's taking the sandbags off the truck and trying to put them here to patch the levee.
His way, wherever he could, even the footings of the levee beneath him. But as hard as he worked, he was no match for the river.
Yeah, I think it's a lost cause. See what Vern is doing? He's digging out the levee to patch the levee. That's desperation.
What amazed me about the whole thing is how quick it went.
And that's Vern. He's actually crying. But yeah, it's really not much humans can do against nature. I know over the last 50 years or so, they've created the impression that as human beings, we can change the way we do things and save ourselves from changes in nature or protect ourselves from hurricanes and tornadoes. But really, They're gigantic natural phenomena that are far beyond what we can control, even floods.
93 at places like Kaskaskia Island, 9 miles south
Broken
of St.
levee.
Genevieve. There, no amount of effort could maintain the levees or save the town.
It was an amazing sight, the Mississippi River flexing its seemingly unlimited muscle. Dozens of homes and other buildings, including the town's church, all underwater. Some islanders believe the flood will be the death of a community whose history goes back nearly 200 years.
In the past, it was common to build cities in the floodplains of rivers. And so massive floods were much more common back then than they are today. What about 25 years ago, the levees broke along the Mississippi, and you had communities that existed for hundreds of years were eventually destroyed and became ghost towns. But I think civilizations pretty much learned not to build in the floodplain, which wasn't the case in the past. So you very often see houses being ripped up, and that time they built houses to last, and so you will see them floating down the river. If you've read Huckleberry Finn, there's a chapter where it talks about them going out on one of these houses, and I think Huckleberry Finn's father is there on the house, dead or something. If you've seen the movie, they change it from a house to a boat because it seems really bizarre to have a house floating down the river, but not necessarily. If you build the house really well, they can remain intact for quite a while traveling down the river. Here's an example. So the house is going to hit the bridge. You think the bridge or the house is going to win? Yeah, it looks like the bridge is going to win. This is a good example of cresting. The bridge is a flat bridge, and so this is the point of flood. And once it flows out of the channel into the floodplain, it can do a tremendous amount of violence and damage to surrounding buildings and structures and so on. These floods can come on very rapidly once the levee breaks, or if you're in an area with a very high rainfall, that especially if the rainfall occurs very rapidly, it can create a wall of water that moves down the channel. And they call that a flash flood. And so it will go from just a stream flow, a normal stream flow, to something like this in a matter of just a few minutes. And it can be quite treacherous if you get caught in a flash flood. During the flood stages, the river crests into the floodplain. Even though there may not be houses and neighborhoods in the floodplain, very often there are roadways. And so the roadway goes underwater. And so if you're ever driving and you see something like this, your brain may tell you that it's very shallow and you can get around the bend because you really have to get to the birthday party or whatever. But don't do it, okay? If you ever see something like this where you're driving into water where you can't see the other side, Professor Spencer says, turn around, drive down till you find a McDonald's, get out and buy a Happy Meal and wait a few hours. This is very, very dangerous. Even though it may not look dangerous, it is. You know why this is dangerous? What the contributing factor is? Most people don't think about. Your tires have air in them. So your tires are going to act like a inner tube. And so as you drive out into this water, once it gets to 6 or 7 inches deep, your tires are going to lift your car. And once your tires lift your car, especially if you have a small car, it's going to lift your car, and then you're going to be floating. And as your car floats, where is it going to take you? It's not going to take you to the edge. It's going to take you out into the channel because that's where the fastest water is. And so you're going to be in a small car floating out into the middle of this river, and cars are not made like boats. They're not made to float. And so the top of the car and the engine block are very heavy. So what's going to happen is your car is going to flip over. and that's going to put you underwater. And you're going to be trapped inside of your car, floating down a river underwater. And it's going to be very difficult to break the window because the pressure of the water pushing in. And even if you do break the window, you're going to have probably 30 or 40 seconds of water rushing into your car. And it's going to be very difficult to impossible to try to swim out until it equalizes inside of your car. So you have to hold your breath for about 30 or 40 seconds. Then you're going to have to swim out into the channel and then swim to shore, which most people don't. So they die. And they die because they thought they could make it through shallow water. And they forgot that their tires will act like inner tubes and carry them out into the river. All right, the Mississippi River. This is a satellite image. You can see the river here. You can see all the old meanders. The Corps of Engineers have gone in and intentionally straightened the Mississippi because it's a major conduit for trade in the United States. And if you can take out all those meanders, that saves a lot of time and a lot of money. And so we've artificially altered the Mississippi River. However, if you look at a map, you can see the old meander channels. If you read Mark Twain, he talks about life on the Mississippi River and navigating the bends and how to see the shallow areas and so on. I think I read that Mark Twain is actually when he chose Mark Twain as his pen name, I think his birth name is Samuel Clemens. But when he chose the name Mark Twain, I think it was a reference to what happens on the Mississippi River when they throw the twain, the string into the river to mark the depth, and they mark the string or something. Seems like I've heard that somewhere. The Mississippi River flows to the Gulf of Mexico, and where it flows out, it creates a delta. In this case, what they call a crow's foot delta, because it has these extensions that looks kind of like the talons of a crow, I guess. It's a simple process. Whenever the river flows into a body of water, the fresh water flows out on top of the salty water, which is heavier. And that frictional drag causes it to slow down. When the water slows down, it dumps its sediment right there at the mouth of the river. As that sediment piles up, it builds out into the Gulf of Mexico as a delta. This is a satellite image of the Mississippi River where it flows into the Gulf of Mexico. This is New Orleans, which is built along the Mississippi. New Orleans sits about 5 feet below sea level. And so whenever Katrina came through, the levees broke on Lake Pontchartrain. And as we've talked about before, New Orleans became a Venice, completely flooded, 5 to 6 feet of water. And it lasted for many days. Normally, when a place floods, it only floods for a few hours and the floodwaters flow away and it's dry again. But whenever you have a levee that breaks along a river, there's a constant supply of water, and so it remains flooded for weeks at a time. And so as the soil becomes extremely waterlogged, then if you have anything underneath the soil, such as a casket that has air in it, it will want to rise to the surface, and it will. And so after several days of flooding, you'll see caskets coming up out of the ground and floating down the river. So people have to go out and catch the casket with the corpse inside and tie it to trees to hold it there till they can rebury it. That's the reason if you've ever been to New Orleans, you know that most of the cemeteries are above ground. They're mausoleums that have been stacked. Try to keep this from happening. Here's another example of cemeteries where the buoyancy of the coffin has actually lifted the cement caps to the burial vaults and floated out. And so people have to go out and grab them, tie them together, wait for the flood to recede so they can find out what to do with the caskets. If you bury them, they'll probably just come up in the next flood. Anyway, this shows the Mississippi and the Crow's Foot Delta. If you look carefully, you can see all the sediment from the river as it flows out. The Mississippi is freshwater. The Gulf of Mexico is saltwater. Saltwater has about 3% dissolved minerals, so it's much more dense. So the freshwater flows out on top of the saltwater, and it creates a wedge. This is not the Mississippi and not the Gulf of Mexico, but it does show the difference in the densities of two rivers coming together. See, the river on the right is full of sediment, mud, therefore it's much denser. The river on the left has very little mud, and so it's lighter, and you can see how it formed a wedge. You see the mud below, you can see it through the reflected water. So there's a wedge here. If you were to measure vertically, you would have a layer of fresh water, and then you would go down into this layer of muddy water. Same thing happens along the Mississippi, where you have fresh water at the surface and salt water below. And I've been told people that fish along the delta of the Mississippi, there are places where you can drop a line with several lures on the line, and you can catch freshwater and saltwater fish on the same line at the same time, because you're fishing through this wedge. Rivers are constantly changing their channel. It's not just that the channel is moving, but sometimes it will switch back into an old channel. They call that an avulsion. This is a before and after shot. The left-hand side is before. We have the river channel moving to the north, and the right-hand side is after. And you can see that this river channel in China has gone from north to a westward flow, and it's created a new delta. That would be called an avulsion. The old Mississippi Valley actually flowed straight into the Gulf of Mexico. It makes a hard left-hand turn now. And New Orleans is in this area right here. And the Mississippi wants to go straight. It wants to go back into this old channel. I think they call it the Chafalaya. Yeah, right here. You see it there? That's the Chafalaya. And the Mississippi, when it makes this bend, wants to go straight back in the Chafalaya. And the Corps of Engineers spend millions and millions of dollars to reinforce the levees here to keep that from happening. Because if it did happen and the Mississippi broke, and believe me, if it broke and went into the old Chafalaya, there's nothing they could do about it. They couldn't reroute it. And so the Mississippi would flow in this area, and New Orleans wouldn't have all of the business
lay underwater.
All of the business to boost the economy coming from the trade along the Mississippi. So it would be a bad thing for New Orleans if the Mississippi changes course.
Lay underwater. Temporary levees wove through town, creating an artificial waterfront. A man-made island rose where Wenner Street had once met North Main. The work of 4 families who banded together in a desperate battle to save their homes. But 1993 brought...
Yeah, it just shows what you have to do if you decide to build in a floodplain and there's a flood coming. The only way to really save your home is to build a cofferdam out of sandbags and to constantly pump the water out, which if you did that with every flood, that would be a tremendous amount of work.
The worst deluge in a century and a half. The Mississippi became a monstrous adversary, and the struggle would last for months. But a flood is a disaster in slow motion. It can last as long as the rain continues to fall, as long as the water continues to rise.
Yeah, this is the images you saw there are the floods in the 1990s that were so massive that it wiped out communities that had been rebuilding for hundreds of years, and they just decided to not rebuild. They became ghost towns because of the frequency of the floods.
Months. But many floods happen fast, too fast for any response. In southern France in 1992, torrential...
Yeah, this is a good clip to show you what cars do, how they float and how they flip over.
Rains raised river levels as much as 50 feet in just a few hours. The resulting flash floods overwhelmed defenseless towns, and dozens drowned. These changes in practice and policy amount to an admission that we can't fight nature and win.
That's interesting he says that. It's a very rare statement today. The general consensus is that we can control nature. We can have dominion over it. Some even believe that's what the Bible says when God commands us to subdue the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. It's the reason it's important for you guys to understand Hebrew, because people that imply that it's telling us that we can take control of the planet Earth, the third planet from the sun. The word eretz there, to subdue the earth, generally means the ground. And subdue is the Hebrew word kabosh, which has come into English. If you watch mixed martial arts, where you have these fighters or something, it'll say, he really put the kibosh on him. That's usually when they just got a body slam. The word kibosh in Hebrew, I believe, means to pound. And so when it says to subdue the earth, it doesn't mean that we're going to, through science, somehow control the weather or control volcanoes or earthquakes. Even in our redeemed state, we're not going to be able to do that. What the words mean is that we are to pound the ground, essentially, usually in reference to a hoe and shaping the earth. That's the reason it's associated with being fruitful and multiplying and subdue the earth. That means we're providing for our fruitfulness. We take a plot of ground and we subdue it and we grow crops so that we can feed our families. That's the general idea, not a reference to how sometimes we have to become gods and control the weather or think we can control it. All right, I mentioned flash floods earlier. Flash floods are very common in desert areas where it very rarely rains. But when it does rain, you get lots of water flowing through these stream valleys very rapidly. And the term of these desert streams is called an arroyo. Have you heard the term arroyo? Okay. Well, if you ever hear the term arroyo, it's a Spanish word, which means a dry stream bed in the desert. It remains dry throughout most of the year, and when there's a rainstorm, there may be a flash flood that floods through it for 4 or 5 hours, and then it's dry again. That's an arroyo. You have the same type of stream valleys in the Bible lands. They call them wadis, W-A-D-I, a wadi. A wadi and arroyo are the same thing. They're desert streams that only flow during a rain, and they only flow for a short time. And then all the water soaks back into the desert sand. I think scripture uses a wadi as reference to the fact that some people's devotion is only for very short periods of time, and then it dries up. I remember when the Twin Towers fell on 9/11, the Congress was out on the Capitol steps holding hands and praying to God together for about a day, and then they stopped. All the comedians stopped making jokes. There was no time to be joking when you face such a tragedy. But that was only for a short time. They were like wadis in the desert. These are some photographs taken of a flash flood in the Dead Sea area. It's coming out of the Wadi Qumran. Spent a lot of time working at Qumran, and I remember when we were there, there were people rappelling on ropes over the edge of this wadi. And I was telling one of the students that that's not very safe. If you're going to rappel over the edge of a wadi, you need to check what the weather's like upstream, because if it's raining, you could be hanging 100 feet over a 300-foot cliff and have a giant wall of water come rushing over, wash you off the ropes and kill you or drown you. And the student didn't seem to take it very seriously, and he really wasn't in the mood to learn anything about geology. So I stopped talking about it. But I found out that the next year there was a flash flood. There were people rappelling on that very cliff, and 2 of them died from the same process I just described. And this is a flash flood that occurred in that very valley, washing over the roadway there into the Dead Sea. This is a video clip showing a flash flood. This is in Saudi Arabia, I think. Yeah, Saudi Arabia. So you can see the wall of water coming. People are watching on the bridge. It's not raining there, but it's rained upstream. These people here are running down into the stream, which is not, this is not smart. You want to be running uphill, not downhill. Unless they have a death wish. Or they don't understand the power of a flash flood. So you see how rapidly it comes up, moves very rapidly. Oftentimes it'll be saturated with logs and sticks, debris, which you don't want to be in it. Just the timbers there would kill you. All right, there's a geological formation that occurs whenever you have these flash floods. They create a fan of sediment called an alluvial fan. And so as it comes out of the channel, what you see here, into an open valley, the water flows out into a thin layer, and the same process that forms levees happens here, where it drops its sediment and it forms this fan of debris called an alluvial fan. This is a model. You see the plywood on either side, but they've created a very natural looking alluvial fan. It's called a fan because it looks like one of those fans that oriental fans that you fan yourself with. And this is as the water fans out, it dumps the sediment into that shape. So some examples of alluvial fans. The sediment that rivers carry is called alluvium. So therefore the alluvial comes from the sediment of the river. When we get to glaciers, we'll talk about the sediment that glaciers carry is called moraine. Same basic process. One's frozen and one's liquid, but the sediment that's deposited by it has a different term. So this is an alluvial fan. Another feature of stream flow is something called headward erosion. Whenever a stream is flowing over some resistant rock layer, it creates a waterfall. This is one of the most famous waterfalls. Do you know its name? Yeah, this is Niagara Falls. There's a cliff. The cliff was once here. That's the reason they built the honeymoon hotel, because at one time this is where the falls were. So you take your bride there, get a room, you can look out on the balcony and see Niagara Falls. Well, Niagara Falls has moved upstream. That's called headward erosion, meaning it's eroding back toward the head of the river. Where the river starts is called its head, where it ends up in the ocean is called the mouth of the river. So this is headward erosion. And it occurs as water flows over the edge of the cliff, drops down, and creates erosion at the bottom. I'll show you, I think I have a diagram will show that process in there. They actually diverted the river there so that they could reinforce Niagara Falls to try to keep it within view of this hotel. They were afraid it was going to migrate too far away and they were going to lose business because they didn't want a hotel that was 2 miles away from the falls. Anyway, shots of the the water going over the edge of Niagara Falls. Yeah, thought I had a diagram. I guess I don't have to draw it. All right, if you have a cliff and you have water coming over the cliff, when it goes over, it creates a tremendous amount of energy just due to gravity as the water falls. And when it hits the bottom, that energy is directed in all directions. There's really nothing to erode here, but when that water hits this part, it begins to erode. And so it creates a notch. Sometimes a cave. There's a very famous scene in Last of the Mohicans where they go behind the waterfall into the cave. That's this cave that's behind the waterfall. But anyway, the cave forms, the notch forms, and eventually it cuts deep enough that it begins to undermine this cliff. And so that section, just due to gravity, is going to fall. And when that occurs, you have a new fall here. And so it's moved. So that explains headward erosion. And that process will continue. And this material will be eroded back. And all of it will be carried by the river to the sea. And so it's like taking a planer and you're planing away this material, dumping it into the sea. Matter of fact, if rivers had their way, all of everything above sea level will be picked up and thrown into the sea, not just the mountain. So downward erosion is the cutting of the channel downward. Headward erosion is when it's cutting back toward the head of the river. All right, any questions on that stream flow? Water not only flows at the surface of the earth, it also flows under the earth. And whenever there's a magma chamber, molten rock, it heats the water. And so you can create what are called hot springs and geyser basins and so on. One of the most famous, of course, is Yellowstone. These are images of the hot springs there at Yellowstone, the rock formations that occur as the water is heated. It dissolves different minerals, especially calcium carbonate and silicate minerals. And then as it cools, it releases those minerals as crystals, and they build up these really strange formations that indicate hot springs, geyser basins, and so on. These are images of the hot springs there in Yellowstone. And they look very similar when you go to other places around the world where you have groundwater setting over a magma chamber. So prismatic springs, it's a hot springs that has certain types of algae and bacteria that create different colors.
With nature, and that depends on every one of us. This is a magical place. It's really a wonder of nature. All those colors you can see are due to bacteria and tiny microscopic algae that change color according to the water temperature.
This is actually part of an underground system of caverns. The flow of the groundwater has dissolved away the rock and created these tunnels, these chambers, where the chambers come to the surface. If they're under pressure, you can actually produce geysers, where the water will shoot up out of the chambers into the air in over a certain time period. This is what geyser basins look like before they're erupting. It's just a pool with a cavern below it. As the magma chamber heats up the water, eventually it will reach the boiling point where it goes from a liquid to a gas. When that occurs, that gas bubble, as it rises upward, acts like a piston, and it just pushes that column of water up into the air and creates what is called a geyser. When the water first gets to the surface, you can actually see the bubble, the gas coming up, and then as it escapes, it pulls the water up into the air. Most famous geyser in America, at least, is Old Faithful. You see here near the lodge at Yellowstone National Park. I was there in the early 80s. I think they had a schedule on the wall. That's how faithful it was. The flow of heat into the water and the flow of water into the chamber was so regular that they could actually time to the minute when it would erupt. And it was like every 90 minutes that you would have an eruption. I think it erupts on a slower scale now because they've been pumping water out of the aquifer there for the lodge, and I think it changed it's still faithful, but it's a little bit slower than it used to be. Anyway, this is the Old Faithful at its peak eruption. And there are other geysers, even at Yellowstone and around the world. These are other versions of geysers. They all function on the same principles, though. That when the water heats up and the phase change from a liquid to a gas, that creates a feedback. And as the gas rises, it pulls the water up into the air. There are other places where it's just mud. And so you have lots of gas coming up, but instead of nice high fountains, it's just bubbling mud pits. All right, so the groundwater, as it moves below the surface, erodes the rock and forms passageways. It's in the zone of saturation, so these passageways are full of water. However, when the water table drops or when the land area rises, either due to sea level fluctuation or tectonic activity, it pushes up above the water table, then you have places where these passageways are open. They're full of air rather than water. They're in the zone of aeration. And that's what we call caverns and caves. Let's take a trip through some of these caverns. Generally, the term cavern means that you have several rooms that are interconnected, whereas cave usually is something smaller, reference to one particular room. The vast majority of caves and caverns are extremely ugly and boring. They just look like holes in the rock. When you hear the term, you often think of a place that has all kinds of beautiful formations inside, but that's the exception rather than the rule. Most of the time, the groundwater passing from the surface down to the zone of saturation, the water table, is moving around these voids, but when it does go through one of the voids, it decorates it and creates beautiful speleothems, as they call them. But anyway, this is what most caves look like. Probably 98% of caves are just holes underground. And nobody lights it up and puts little trails down into it for tourists, because they would get there and say, this is just a hole in the ground. I want to see something exciting. But where the groundwater does flow through the caves, it produces cave formations called speleothems. And this is generally what you see, beautiful formations that decorate. Whenever a drop of water is moving downward due to gravity and passes into a cave or cavern, there's a change in temperature inside the cave. It gets cooler, and there's a change in pressure. So it gets cooler and the pressure goes down, and it releases minerals, especially calcium carbonate, gypsum. They form crystals along the edge and eventually grow from that fracture down into the cave is what's called a stalactite. If you look carefully, you can see crystals that are forming in the droplet of water. Those crystals are destined to be on the floor of the cave when the water drops. When it hits the floor, not only does it release the crystals that are in the drop, but the agitation causes more crystals to form. And so you build up material from the floor of the cave called a stalagmite. This is a test question, so pay close attention. Stalactites grow from the ceiling. Stalagmites grow from the floor. So you got to hang tight to the ceiling. You've got to be mighty growing up from the floor. And eventually they connect and form columns. It's a similar process that if you had a can of soda and you shake it, the agitation causes the carbon dioxide to come out of solution. When the drop hits the floor, it's shaken and minerals come out of solution. Whenever you take the lid off of a soda, it releases carbon dioxide because of the pressure drop. Same thing happens when the drop enters into a cave. It goes from high pressure to low pressure, and it releases these crystals, chemicals that form crystals and so on. Here's an example of a stalactite growing from the ceiling. Whenever you cut them and polish the insides, you can see the individual layers that have been formed over the centuries as each drop of water has left a very thin layer of calcium carbonate. As I mentioned, the stalactite from the ceiling will eventually connect with the stalagmite growing from the floor, and they'll form columns. This particular column, evidently there'd been an earthquake and it broke at some point, moved. Anyway, these are some examples of columns. Once they connect, they continue to grow as water flows down them, creating this flow stone. The idea is to fill up the cave again. Nature is patching itself. As the water flowed through and dissolved it in the zone of saturation, it's now flowing through and filling it in the zone of aeration. They take many curious shapes, and if you go into these tours, they like to name them. So it's like called the pipe organ because it looks like the pipes of a pipe organ. As the water chemistry changes, it can go from depositing minerals to corroding minerals, boring a hole back through the stalagmite. I remember visiting inner space north of Austin and Georgetown, and the guide was saying how each inch of the stalactite takes hundreds of thousands of years to form, and then they changed the groundwater of chemistry there in Georgetown. I went back like 10 years later, and it looked someone had taken caramel and thrown it all over the formations because it was dissolving more limestone. And it was very obvious that it wasn't taking that long for it to grow, because within 10 years, it covered many of the formations. So water chemistry is important in terms of how the cave is decorated. If it's a fracture in the ceiling rather than a puncture or a hole, it'll create a curtain of debris that'll form, or minerals that'll form. You put a light behind it, it looks like a piece of bacon, but it's not bacon, it just looks like bacon. If you're really hungry, you want to eat it. Most of the formations in the caves are calcium carbonate or limestone, which is fairly resistant. However, there are some caves where you have a lot of sulfides, and rather than creating limestone, it will create gypsum. And so you have gypsum caves, which take a much more delicate look to them. Here's some gypsum and aragonite formations, extremely delicate crystals. They found a cave in West Texas, Sonora, I think, the Sonora caves, that had many of these gypsum formations. They eventually had to close it though, because the crystals were so delicate that when people came into the cave, their body temperature and their breath was actually changing the humidity and temperature, and it was dissolving the formation. So they closed it. But my son told me a few years ago, I think they've opened it back up because they put in a system where they can control the temperature and humidity a lot more now. Anyway, these are some gypsum formations there in Sonora. Very delicate. This is gypsum crystals near, it's not Carlsbad, but it's near Carlsbad. This is a deep cave in Mexico. I think it's in Mexico. called Lechagia that has very beautiful and gigantic gypsum formations. I thought you might want to see it from the blue planet. The upper part is not decorated. The lower part has beautiful gypsum formation.
And when sulfuric acid dissolves limestone, it leaves behind gypsum, the basis of Lechugia's remarkable formations. And there was one set more than a mile from the surface that almost defied belief. The Chandelier Ballroom was the ultimate discovery. With its 6-meter-long crystals, it's surely the most bizarre cave chamber in the world.
Of course, they put in the lights to make it look beautiful. Actually, it's just pitch black without the lights.